A half-dead donkey staggered out of the desert and collapsed on Ada Vale's porch, ribs showing, eyes clouded, a wedding ring and a pouch of gold in its saddlebag. No note, no name she recognized, just a vow etched into metal and a map drawn by a dying hand. Ada hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, but something in the donkey's eyes told her this wasn't just chance. It was a promise, unfinished, unburied, and waiting. She didn't ask why it came to her. She just picked up the ring and followed the trail. It was near the end of the dry season when the donkey appeared, hobbling up the hill to her front porch with one leg dragging like a bad memory, and eyes gone cloudy with exhaustion. The sun had already cooked the earth to cracked leather, and the sky above was the color of bleached bone. She'd been living alone for 3 years at that point, out past Dry Cistern and east of anywhere a map still remembered. Her name was Ada Vale, and by then she'd stopped expecting visitors, human or otherwise. When she stepped out and saw the animal standing there, swaying, ribs showing through hide-like fence posts beneath a torn tarp, she didn't speak, didn't ask where it had come from, only moved slowly down the porch steps with a pail of water and a crust of bread in her hand. The donkey didn't flinch, just stared at her, the way things do when they've run out of ways to ask for help. Its legs buckled the moment the water touched its tongue, and it dropped to its knees on the packed dirt like a sinner at the end of a sermon. That's when she saw the saddlebag. It was old, cracked leather, sun-bleached, but held tight by a strap that hadn't rotted. The mark on it was faint, some kind of family crest maybe, or just initials worn to dust, but it was what spilled from the flap that stopped her breath, a pinch of gold dust, glinting like broken stars in the morning light, and something heavier, darker, that rolled across the porch when she opened the pouch further. A ring. Not just any ring, a wedding band, thick, worn, etched on the inside with a date and a name, AJ to MV always. She turned it in her hand slowly, heart kicking once in her chest like a spooked colt, then picked up the gold dust pouch, weighing it, already knowing it was real, too fine to be fake, too much to be ignored. The donkey let out a low groan, slumping fully to its side now, breath coming in slow hitches. Ada crouched down beside it, ran a hand over its flank. "Where the hell did you come from?" she whispered. The donkey didn't answer, just closed its eyes. She looked back at the saddlebag, then at the ring, then out toward the horizon, where the earth shimmered like it was trying to remember something. And she understood, whatever story this animal had walked out of, it wasn't finished yet. She spent the better part of the day nursing the donkey, moving slow and speaking low, like the way she used to calm her father's old mule back when she was a girl, long before the war, before the graves, before she came out here alone. She wetted cloth and laid it across the animal's neck, let it sip water from her hand, and when it finally slept, she sat beside it in the shade with the ring in her palm, turning it over and over until the sun dipped west. The name inside the band meant nothing to her, AJ to MV. But the shape of the ring did. It was handmade, heavy, the kind folks carved from their own coin or melted down as a promise. Whoever wore it once, they hadn't bought it. They'd bled for it. She tucked it in her pocket, the gold dust in a jar on her shelf, and waited to see if the donkey would live through the night. It did. Barely. When the wind rose, the creature whimpered in its sleep, legs twitching like it was running from something in its dreams. At first light, Ada saddled her own mare, packed bread, jerky, coffee, and the contents of the donkey's saddlebag. She left the animal penned in with shade and water, scratched a small circle around it in the dirt, something her grandmother had taught her for protection or superstition, depending on who you asked, and then she rode. Not to town, not yet. She went west, following the trail the donkey must have limped in from. The tracks were faint, already half consumed by dust and wind, but she found the line of them curving around the base of the ridge and disappearing into the mouth of the canyon like breadcrumbs left by something too tired to care about being followed. She rode slow, one hand near her rifle, eyes scanning the scrub and stone. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind, just the whisper of her horse's hooves over dry rock and the steady beat of her heart in her ears. She found the camp around midday. What was left of it? A fire long gone cold, 2 bedrolls, 1 overturned pack with its contents scattered, tin plate, fork, a pocket Bible with the cover torn, and blood. Not fresh, but not old either. A drag mark in the dirt leading away from the bedrolls, about 15 yards, to where the flies buzzed thick over a shape half covered in loose rock. She dismounted slowly, approached with her rifle up, and knelt beside the mound. It wasn't a proper grave, just a man covered enough to be hidden from the sky. His face was swollen from sun and death, but his coat was open, and on his shirt, over the heart, were the initials A.J. She looked down at the ring in her palm, then back at the man. Same initials, same story. He died here. Maybe from the wound, maybe from whatever came before it. She dug the grave properly, gave him shade, stacked the stones neat and high. Who was M.V.? She asked the dirt. It didn't answer. She took the saddlebag remnants, whatever wasn't ruined, and made her way back to the donkey before the sun dropped. That night the donkey stood again. Wobbled, but stood. She fed it oats from her hand and whispered the story back to it. "A.J.'s dead," she said. "But he sent you somewhere. You got gold on you, a ring. What else were you supposed to carry?" The donkey looked at her, and in its eyes she didn't see understanding, just expectation, like it was waiting for her to finish something it didn't know how to ask for. She went through the saddlebag again that night, every stitch, every seam, and in the false bottom she found it, a folded piece of oilskin, cracked and sweat-stained. Inside was a map, rough, hand-drawn, but clear enough. A canyon, a bend in the river, a mark that said vow with a circle drawn beside it. The gold dust hadn't been payment, it had been proof. The ring wasn't a relic, it was a message. Someone was waiting, someone named M.V. And so, at first light, she packed a second saddle, for the donkey, and she rode east. She followed the map through badlands and ravines that hadn't seen a living soul in years, where the wind carved songs into stone and the sun bled the color out of the sky by midday. The donkey followed behind her like it knew the way, limping but steady, every step deliberate, never straying. Ada rode with her hat low and her hand near her revolver, eyes always scanning the trail ahead and behind. The map took her along dry creek beds and up through box canyons that felt too quiet, places where the air was heavy even without heat, like something had happened there and the land still remembered. She didn't rush. You don't when you're carrying gold and a name no one's spoken aloud. She made camp near a stand of cottonwoods, let the horses drink deep, and spent the evening staring at the ring under the firelight, wondering who M.V. was and what kind of promise A.J. had made to carry something all the way across this dying land. On the 4th day she reached the place the map called Vow. It wasn't a town. It wasn't even a building. It was a bend in the river, deep and green, where the cliffs folded close like 2 hands cupped around a secret. There was a stone there, tall and flat, carved with initials. Not recent, but not ancient either. M.V. plus A.J. beneath a crude heart, weathered by years of wind and water. Ada dismounted slow, heart beating strange in her chest, like the wind had turned it backward. She walked the riverbank, the donkey tethered to a tree, and found the trail she hadn't expected. Boot prints, fresh, more than one set. Someone had been here, maybe still was. She followed the tracks upstream through brush and sand until she saw the cabin, small, crooked, leaning like it didn't trust its own roof. Smoke rose from the chimney. She approached with her hand on the grip of her revolver, her steps slow but steady. She knocked once. A voice called out from inside, low and tired, "Go away." She knocked again. This time, silence. Then the door creaked open and a woman stood there, thin, gray at the temples, eyes rimmed with grief that had settled long ago and never left. She looked at Ada for a long moment before saying, "You bring the donkey?" Ada nodded. "He found me at my door." The woman swallowed, her hands trembling as she reached out and touched the edge of the saddlebag slung over Ada's shoulder. "You have it?" "I do," Ada said and handed her the ring. The woman took it like it might fall apart in her hands. She turned it over, saw the engraving, and closed her eyes. "He made it," she whispered. "He promised he'd come back. I told him it was foolish, that no gold was worth dying over. He died anyway," Ada said softly. "But he got this far, left the donkey with me, left a trail." The woman nodded, tears slipping down her cheek, without a sound. "He always did believe in finishing things." They buried the ring beneath the stone the next morning, beside the carving. The woman, Mary Vale, laid flowers she'd dried and kept for years in a box beneath her bed. She didn't ask for the gold dust. Ada left it anyway, in a jar on the porch, beside a note that said, "He kept his word." She rode away without looking back. The donkey stayed. It didn't need to follow her anymore. Sometimes the dead send messengers who don't know they're carrying more than weight. Sometimes a promise finds its way home. Ada didn't return home right away. After leaving the cabin by the river, after watching the old woman lean down and press the ring into the earth like it might still beat beneath the stone, she felt something in her bones say, "Not yet. Not yet time to stop moving. Not yet time to settle back into her old chair, into the porch dust, and the silence of her lonesome stove." There was more to the trail. She could feel it, like a thread tugging at her ribs, gentle but firm, pulling her toward something unfinished. She headed north, away from the river bend, cutting across scrubland that hadn't tasted rain in half a year, letting the wind guide her in its odd circling way. Her horse moved steady, never faltering. The saddle creaked beneath her, and the sky stretched so wide it made her feel small again, in a way she hadn't felt since before the fire that took her brother, before the silence that came after. For 3 days she rode without a name on her lips, only the memory of the initials in the ring and the map drawn by hands that had likely never touched paper before then. On the 4th day she came across a stage stop half collapsed, leaning into a dry gully where the wind had carved the shape of a crow's wing into the dirt wall. The place looked long deserted, but she saw signs, tracks, ashes, cold but recent, boot prints that circled back on themselves like the owner hadn't decided whether to stay or go. She dismounted, rifle in hand, and called out. No answer. She stepped slow, boots crunching over grit and broken glass, until she reached the back wall. There, beneath the faded sign that once read Water Song Station, she saw a blanket laid out on the floor, a half-empty canteen, and a journal with pages flapping in the breeze. She picked it up, thumbed through the pages. Most were empty, but the last one was written in a tight, anxious scrawl. "They followed me from the canyon. I think they know about the ring, about the dust. I buried the rest under the Godstone, west of the ridge. If I don't make it, tell her I tried. I kept the vow." It wasn't signed, but the writing looked familiar, like it had been done by someone whose hands were shaking. She turned toward the west, the Godstone. She'd heard the name before, spoken once in a saloon by a man who had too much scar and too little smile, who'd whispered about a place where the earth cracked open and glowed red at dawn. She packed what was left from the station, rode out, and found it by sunset the next day. A monolith of sandstone rising out of the desert, like a finger accusing the sky. At its base, wind-worn boulders, and beneath one, exactly where the note had said, a bundle wrapped in canvas and twine. She dug it out slow, heart thudding, and opened it beneath the shadow of the godstone. Inside, another pouch of gold dust, heavier. A second ring, this one smaller, with a different inscription, MV to AJ, still, and a letter. She read it by firelight that night. If this reaches you, I'm sorry. I thought I could make it all the way back, but I was wrong. I thought the gold would buy us freedom, but I didn't understand the cost. They followed me. I shook them, I think. If I don't make it, don't follow. Don't try to finish it. Just remember I loved you, and I never stopped walking toward you, even when I couldn't see the trail anymore. A. Ada sat there until dawn, letting the words settle, letting the wind take what it wanted. She would carry the ring back to the woman at the river. She would bury it beside the first, and then she would go home. Because not all gold is meant to be spent. Some is meant to be delivered, some to be buried, and some to remind the living how far love will crawl just to keep a promise. She returned to the river in silence, her horse moving slow, as if it too understood that this wasn't a ride made in haste, but in memory. The landscape looked different now, though she knew it hadn't changed, just her eyes had. The river still cut clean through the rock, green and glinting under the morning sun, and the trees leaned toward it like parishioners toward a pulpit. Mary Vale was out front when Ada arrived, sitting on the porch with her hands folded and a shawl wrapped tight across her shoulders. She didn't rise. She didn't smile. She just looked at Ada the way someone does when the part they buried won't stay buried. Ada dismounted without speaking and walked up the steps. She reached into her coat and pulled out the second ring, the one that bore Mary's initials this time, and placed it gently into her open hand. Mary didn't speak either. She just closed her fingers around it like she was trying to hold on to something that might disappear if she let it breathe. There was more, Ada said finally. Gold, a letter, a promise. Mary looked out toward the stone at the river's bend, her mouth moving just slightly, maybe to pray, maybe just remembering the sound of his name. Did he suffer? She asked. Yes, Ada answered, but not for long, and not without purpose. Mary nodded once, that was all. They buried the second ring beside the first, no stone to mark it, only a small pile of river rocks arranged in a circle, the way Mary said AJ used to do when they were young and wild, and thought the world was theirs to name. That night Mary lit a lantern and left it burning on the porch until dawn. When the sun rose, she blew it out and went inside. And when Ada saddled her horse to leave, she didn't say goodbye. She didn't have to. The trail back home was quiet, the wind slow, as if the earth itself had settled something heavy in its chest. Ada arrived at her cabin just before the first rain of the season. She stabled the horse, unpacked her bags, and sat on the porch with her boots still dusty and the taste of the trail still on her tongue. The jar of gold dust she'd left behind sat untouched on the mantel. She didn't look at it, didn't need to. Some things weren't meant to be exchanged. She took down the old tin box she kept under the floorboard, the one with letters and tokens and half-spent memories, and placed the folded oilskin map inside it. She wrote nothing down. The map didn't need words. It had already done its work. When the rain came, it came heavy, hammering the roof like a long-held breath finally exhaled. She let it fall, listening to the sound of it soak the earth, fill the cracks, wash away the silence. And for the first time in a long while, she slept without dreaming. Because some journeys don't end in riches. They end in keeping a vow. And that was worth more than gold ever could be. Days passed in a rhythm that Ada hadn't known in years. Quiet, slow, honest. She rose with the sun, tended to her garden, rode out to check the fence line. And in the evenings, She sat on the porch with a warm tin mug and watched the world breathe again. The gold dust remained sealed in the jar above the hearth, and she didn't think of spending it. It was not meant for saloons or store counters. It was a symbol now of weight carried and delivered, of a promise kept so fiercely that not even death could pry it from a man's hands. Every now and then she'd take the ring out from its pouch, the one she hadn't buried, the one she couldn't. It was a simple thing, circular, quiet, humble. And she'd hold it between two fingers, feeling the curve of it, thinking of how many miles it had traveled in silence just to end up here in her hand. Sometimes she wondered if Mary Vale still sat on her porch down by the river, watching the bend, waiting for something that had already arrived. Sometimes she wondered if that kind of love was real, or just a story people told themselves so they'd have something to aim for in the dark. She didn't know, but she did know the sound of hooves in dry dirt, and one morning she heard them again. A rider, lone and slow, coming up the path from the southern trail, a dust trail behind him and a limp in the sway of the saddle. Ada stepped out with her hand resting lightly on the stock of her rifle, not out of fear but habit. The man tipped his hat before he spoke. He was older, leather-skinned and sun-bitten, with a gaze that had seen too much and forgotten little. "You, Ada Vale?" She nodded. "That I am." He pulled a folded letter from his coat and handed it down to her. "Was told if I made it far enough north, I'd find you. And if I did, you'd know what to do with this." He didn't wait for her to answer, just turned the horse around and rode back the way he'd come, like the message was the only reason he still had a heartbeat. Ada stood there with the letter unopened in her hand for a long while. It was addressed in fine handwriting, no return, no seal, just her name, and underneath it, 3 words, "He made it." She sat in her chair and opened it slow. Inside was another ring. She didn't cry, not that day. She just sat there as the wind rolled through the grass, as the old boards creaked beneath her boots, and as the fire in her chest, the one that had burned low for years, flared once more, not with anger or longing or sorrow, but with the peace of knowing she had been part of something bigger than herself. Not a legend, not a story. A vow. And some vows don't end with words. They end when someone you've never met shows up and says, "He made it." She kept the ring wrapped in soft cloth and placed it beside the other. 2 circles of worn metal, 2 weights that had traveled farther than most men dared, forged not in flame but in love and hardship and miles of unforgiving country. Ada didn't know the full story, not all of it, and likely never would. But she knew enough to see the truth etched in the lines of that man's face, in the dust on his coat, in the way he didn't ask questions, didn't wait for thanks. He had ridden to the edge of the world to hand her something that mattered to someone else. That meant something. It meant the story had not died out there in the canyons. It had come full circle. She sat on the porch for hours that night, watching the moon slide over the edge of the hills, painting the world silver. The breeze carried the scent of rain still days off, but promising. She lit a lantern and left it burning beside the door like Mary had done, for remembrance, for direction, for those still walking some long road with nothing but a vow tucked in their heart and a name they whisper when no one's listening. The next morning, Ada took the rings and the original map and rode west, toward the stone where AJ and MV's names were carved by hand, by hope, by something that was never meant to be lost. The trail hadn't changed much. The river still turned the same way it always had, gentle and sharp at once, a promise and a warning. The cabin was empty, its roof half fallen, but the land was still sacred, still waiting. She found the spot by the carving and dug with her hands, slow and steady, until she reached the first ring she'd buried there. She placed the second ring beside it. 2 names reunited. No fanfare, no final words, just earth, covering love once more. She placed a flat stone on top this time, smooth and round, and carved a single word into it with her knife. Carried. Because that's what the rings had been, what she had done, what he had done, what they had all done in their own way. They had carried love and weight and gold and grief across deserts and rivers and time itself. She rode back as the sun fell behind her. The sky split in orange and rose. The cabin greeted her like it always had, quiet, strong, unchanged by time, but marked by every return. That night she poured a glass of whiskey and set it next to a second one, empty. Then she raised hers to the air and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. The fire crackled low, and in the light of it, the gold dust jar shimmered on the shelf, unspent, untouched. Because some things aren't meant to be spent. They're meant to be found and kept and carried, until they find their way home. Fall came early that year, curling around the ridges with a chill that bit into the wood grain of the porch and turned the mornings sharp with frost. Ada welcomed it. She had always favored the kind of cold that made you move slower, speak softer. The heat brought trouble. Heat made men restless. But the cold reminded you to be still and tend to the things that kept you alive. She stacked her firewood with care, lined the windows with oiled cloth, patched the gaps in the roof for the fourth time, and when that was done she brought the two journals down from the shelf, the one she had written in over the years and the other smaller one whose pages had first held the map, the promise, and the names. She opened both, side by side on the table, and began to copy the old words into new pages, not to change them, but to preserve them. A story written once in desperation and again in memory. She didn't know who might need to read it someday, but someone would. Someone always did. By the second week of October, a writer came through. Young woman, dusty coat, eyes bright like the horizon hadn't beat her down yet. She asked for water, which Ada gave, and stayed the night when the sky opened up with an early storm that soaked the earth and hissed against the fire like an old grudge. They didn't talk much until morning, but when Ada handed her a cup of coffee, the woman looked down at the table and said, "I heard about you, about the rings, about the donkey with the gold." Ada smiled. "That's a lot to hear about for something that's supposed to be forgotten." "Stories don't get forgotten," the woman said. "They just wait in the quiet for someone to need them again." Ada nodded at that. The woman rode off after breakfast, leaving only a scrap of folded paper behind with a drawing of a river and a note. South Fork still runs slow, dust thick at the curve. It wasn't a question. It was an invitation. Ada tucked the note into the journal and let it be. The winter was harsher than most. The wind came down with teeth, and the snow stayed longer than it should have. Ada kept warm. She read old letters by lantern light and patched her gloves by hand. When the thaw finally came in early March, the trail down past the creek bloomed with new grass. She walked it alone, boots sinking in the mud, and stood at the edge of the ridge overlooking the plains. The air smelled of pine and melting stone. In the distance, the river shimmered like a secret being remembered. She didn't ride out to it, not this time. It was enough to know it was still there, still running, still keeping its promise. She returned to her cabin, fed the chickens, stoked the fire, and wrote a final line in the back of the second journal. Just 7 words, carved in slow and even. 2 rings, 1 vow, never once broken. Then she closed the book, leaned back in her chair, and let the weight of the years settle into her bones like old friends finding their seats. Because when the world forgets everything else, it remembers this. The gold fades, the dust scatters, but the vow remains. And long after her hair turned silver and her hands grew stiff from the years, Ada still rose each morning with the sun creeping through the crooked slats of the shutters, brewed her coffee slow, and sat on that same porch with a blanket around her shoulders and the world at her feet. The gold dust remained untouched on the shelf, the rings wrapped carefully in their cloth pouch, and the journals stacked beneath a floorboard she had reinforced twice since burying the last words. Strangers came and went, some seeking directions, others pretending not to be drawn by stories they'd heard in border towns or saloons from old men with too many teeth missing and too much whiskey in their bellies. Some of them looked at her cabin like it was a place where something important had happened and maybe could again. Ada never confirmed anything. She'd pour them coffee, sometimes offer bread, and answer their questions with her eyes instead of her mouth. They rarely stayed long. A few returned with others, asking about maps, about a canyon, about a river that turned to gold. She let them talk themselves into disappointment, let them wear their boots thin, chasing wind and sand. One spring a man came alone, gray coat, clean boots, eyes that had once known war. He didn't ask about gold, he asked about the donkey. "Did it really walk out of the desert on its own?" he asked. She nodded once. "That's how it came to me." "And the ring?" She stood, walked back inside without a word, and returned with the pouch. She placed it on the table between them and opened it slowly, revealing both bands, the one etched with AJ to MV and the one with MV to AJ. The man stared at them for a long time, lips pressed together, hands trembling slightly. "I saw a woman once," he said quietly. "Down by the river. She was setting flowers in the current. She looked like she was remembering someone she hadn't lost, just misplaced." "You saw Mary Vale," Ada said. "She's gone now, but she waited long enough." "Waited for what?" "For the rings to come back, for the promise to find its way home." The man left without saying goodbye, just rode off slow into the rising sun. Ada watched until the dust settled and the trail grew quiet again. She placed the rings back in their pouch, tucked them beneath the journals, and sat on the porch until the moon replaced the sun, and the fire in her hearth had dwindled to nothing but soft red light. She knew her time would come. Maybe soon, maybe not. But when it did, she wanted someone to find what she'd protected. Not the gold, not the map, the vow. The proof that love, once etched into metal and carried across mountains and blood and time, had made its way home. And if they found it, if they held those rings in their hand and read the words in the journals, they'd know the truth she had come to understand with every mile behind her and every breath she still had left. That gold had only ever been a weight, but the vow was the treasure, and it had been kept. The years that followed moved like river water, slow in places, fast in others, carving the shape of life into the land without asking permission. Ada grew old with grace and solitude. She let the world come to her if it wanted to, but she never went looking any more. Her hands grew slower, her back stiffer, but her mind stayed sharp, fixed always on the promise she had carried and completed, on the trail that Donkey had taken to reach her, on the vow sealed in gold and silence. On the rare occasion a letter arrived from some dusty post, addressed only to the woman at the river bend. She'd smile and read it over the rim of her coffee cup before folding it away into the drawer where she kept the quiet things. Most of them were just words from travelers who had heard about the cabin and wanted to know if the stories were true. She never answered. She didn't need to. The truth had already been told, and it didn't belong to her alone anymore. Then one morning, just before first light, there was a knock at her door. It was soft, hesitant, and when she opened it, the girl standing there looked half vanished by dust and distance. Couldn't have been more than 20, with wild eyes and a scar down her cheek that hadn't healed right. She clutched a ragged satchel in both hands. "You don't know me," she said, "but someone once told me to find you if I ever got lost." Ada stepped aside. No questions. The girl sat by the fire for a long time before speaking again. "I found something in the hills," she said, "under a stone, buried like someone meant it to stay hidden forever." From the satchel she pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle, and when she unrolled it, Ada felt her breath catch. Another ring, similar to the others, but newer. No initials this time, just a single word etched inside. Still. And next to the ring, a handful of gold dust, no more than a palm's worth. "I don't want the gold," the girl said. "I want to know what to do with the rest." Ada picked up the ring, turned it slowly in her fingers, and felt the weight of it settle into her palm like something she already knew. "You deliver it," she said, "to whoever it was meant for." "I don't know who that is," the girl replied. "You will," Ada said. "The trail always tells you eventually." The girl stared at the fire. "What if I lose it?" Ada reached under the floorboard, pulled out the 2 journals, and placed them on the table. "Then someone else finds it. Someone always does." She showed her where to write, where to fold, where to protect the pages from rain and time. She made the girl coffee and packed her some bread and jerky. At sunrise the girl mounted her mule, skinny and tired, but willing, and turned toward the west. Ada watched her ride until the trail bent out of sight. Then she went inside and placed the new ring beside the old ones, now 3 resting together in the quiet. That night she wrote in the back of the journal, just a single line. Another vow on the wind. Then she closed it, poured herself a measure of whiskey, and listened to the fire breathe against the stone. The fire crackled low, throwing soft shadows on the walls of the old cabin as Ada sat still in her chair, the journal resting in her lap, her fingers tracing the leather spine like it was an old friend. Outside the night had settled in, moonlight catching on frost beginning to form along the fence posts, the ground stiffening under the breath of another long winter. She didn't mind. She'd always preferred the quiet, the kind that came after something meaningful had been said, or done, or promised. She sipped her whiskey slow, and thought of the girl on the trail now, carrying that 3rd ring, chasing a story that wasn't hers, but would shape her just the same. That's how it worked. Promises outlasted the people who made them. They kept finding new hands, new roads, new reasons to endure. Ada remembered the donkey's eyes, the weight of the gold dust in the jar, the smell of the river when she first found the stone carved with AJ and MV. Those memories hadn't dulled. If anything, they'd sharpened with time, like the light from a distant lantern drawing closer as the years folded inward. She spent the following days preparing the cabin in small, deliberate ways, repaired a broken hinge on the back door, reinforced the latch on the front, picked the last herbs from the garden before the frost claimed them. She bundled the journals and placed them in a cedar box lined with oilcloth. On the outside she carved a single word, kept. Then she buried the box beneath the floorboards, under the hearth, sealing it with a stone slab she'd shaped herself, not to hide it, just to wait. She left the gold dust untouched, still in its jar on the shelf, just enough to remind her that not everything precious needs to be spent. Most days were still, filled with simple things, chopping wood, boiling water, listening to the wind knock against the shutters like it, too, was looking for someone. One afternoon in early December, another writer came, a boy this time, thin, red-cheeked, no older than 16. He came with a letter and a question, same as most. Said his father had once ridden with a man who knew the river. Said he'd heard of a woman who carried the last true map in her memory. Said he didn't want gold, just truth. Ada let him sit on the porch, gave him warm bread and beans, and told him a story. Not about the river, not exactly, but about a donkey that walked farther than anyone thought it could, carrying a promise heavier than gold. When she finished, the boy nodded like he understood something, even if he couldn't name it. He rode off the next morning, leaving nothing behind but a thank you scratched into the frost on her window. That night Ada sat by the fire again and added a final page to her own journal. The words came easy now. There will always be gold in the river, but the only thing worth chasing is the vow someone died to keep. If you find it, carry it. If you can't carry it, protect it. And if you can't protect it, tell someone who can. Then she closed the book, rested it on the table, and leaned back in her chair with a breath that felt like the last page of a long chapter. Somewhere out there a girl was still riding west. Somewhere out there a promise was still alive. And in the quiet of her cabin, Ada Vale smiled and let the night hold her. The snow came heavy that winter, thick as wool and twice as quiet. It fell over Ada's cabin, blanketing the roof and filling the cracks between the porch boards, softening the sound of the world until it felt like she lived beneath a sky made of ash and breath. She didn't mind the cold. She had wood stacked tall and blankets layered thick, and her body knew how to sit still through hard seasons. But something in her bones told her this winter would be different, not cruel, just final. She felt it in the way her steps slowed, in the way her hands lingered on the journal pages longer than before, as if saying goodbye to each word as it passed under her fingertips. She spent the days tending to what she could, checking the hinges, boiling root tea, mending the stitching on her old coat, though she hadn't worn it in months. At night she sat by the fire, the rings in a tin by the mantel, the journals wrapped in cloth beside her. She didn't speak to them, but she kept them close, like someone waiting to hear a knock that might never come. Then, just after the first thaw of early spring, someone did knock. It was late. Stars sharp in the sky, moon half hidden. The knock was soft, patient, like it had traveled a long way to reach her. Ada stood slow, joints tight, shoulders stiff, and opened the door. A woman stood there, older than the girl who'd come before, maybe 30, boots worn to the sole, coat lined with dust, eyes the color of stormlight. She carried a small canvas pouch in one hand and a rifle slung over her shoulder, but she didn't reach for either. She just looked at Ada and said, "I was told you'd know what to do with this." She held out the pouch. Ada took it gently and opened it with hands that didn't tremble. Inside was a ring, silver, simple, new, no initials, no inscription, just a smooth band, warm from the road. "Who was it for?" Ada asked. The woman looked down. She died before she could say. "All she told me was, 'Find the woman at the river, give her this, she'll know where to put it.'" Ada nodded and stepped aside. They didn't talk much that night. The woman slept by the fire, her back to the door, rifle in reach. Ada sat up late, the ring resting in her palm. She didn't know the names this time, didn't know the weight, but she recognized the shape of a vow when she held one, and that was enough. At first light, they rode out together, Ada on her old mare, the woman on a mule that looked mean enough to bite stone. They crossed the flats in silence, cut through the basin where the canyon walls whispered back your thoughts. By noon they reached the river. The stone with the carvings was still there, moss curling along its base, the water slow and clear. Ada dismounted, walked to the tree line, and dug where she always did. She placed the ring beside the others. There were 4 now, 4 circles buried in soft earth beneath a quiet tree, surrounded by nothing but time and truth. She patted the dirt flat. "Done?" the woman asked. Ada shook her head. "Carried." Then they turned and rode back toward the cabin, 2 silhouettes against the wide blue sky, leaving nothing behind but a story that would one day find its way into someone else's hands. Because vows don't end. They pass on. That spring was the greenest the valley had seen in a decade. The river ran just a little higher. The grass grew long and soft around the base of the stone, and even the wind seemed to blow with less bitterness than usual. Ada woke each day to birdsong instead of silence, and found herself walking farther from the cabin than she used to, tracing old trails, remembering the weight of things she'd carried and the miles they had taken her to leave behind. The woman who'd brought the last ring stayed for a few days, helped split wood, cleared the roof of snow-heavy branches, and never asked for anything in return. They shared meals, spoke only when they had something worth saying, and watched the sun dip behind the hills like it was closing a door. They were both too tired to hold open. On her last morning there, the woman left without ceremony. Just a note on the table written in quick, slanted handwriting. It found its place. "Thank you for holding it." That was all. Ada folded the note and placed it in the journal with the others. The pages were nearly full now, crowded with names and directions and promises that had never asked for recognition, only to be kept. She knew someone would come looking for them again someday. They always did. And when they did, she hoped they'd understand it wasn't the gold that mattered, not really. It never had. It was the choice, the burden, the act of carrying something heavy because it was right, not because it was easy. She sat that afternoon under the cottonwood behind the house, the air thick with the hum of bees and the slow curl of wind, and let her eyes drift toward the tree line where the markers stood hidden from plain sight. The vow rings, buried in their quiet cradle of earth, didn't shine or scream or beg to be found. They just were, steady, kept. She closed her eyes, rested her head back against the trunk, and let the quiet settle around her like a blanket woven from all the words she'd never spoken. When night came, she lit her lantern and left it burning again, the way Mary Vale had once done, the way Ada had after. Not for herself, for whoever came next, because someone always came next. And the vow was always waiting. The lantern burned low through the night, its flame dancing slow and soft behind the glass, casting faint gold across the cabin walls where shadows of the past had lived longer than most people did. Ada slept light, the way she always had, but her dreams were heavy. She saw the river as it once was, rushing, gold-flecked, wild and beautiful, before it became myth, before men bled and broke trying to hold something that was never meant to be owned. She saw the donkey again, limping across the horizon under a sun too big, too bright, carrying a promise it couldn't speak. She saw Mary Vale by the water, hands trembling as she pressed a ring into the soil and whispered to someone already gone. She saw herself, younger and tired, standing at the door as the trail stretched out in front of her, and she understood then what all the miles had meant, how every vow passed from one hand to another wasn't a burden, it was a torch. And torches, she now knew, weren't meant to be held forever, just long enough to light the way for the next soul coming behind. When she woke, the lantern had gone out, and the sky was just beginning to pale with the first light of morning. Ada moved slowly, her joints stiff, her breath shallow, but her hands were still sure as they opened the journal one last time. She wrote carefully, deliberately, each word a thread tying the end of her story to the beginning of someone else's. If you find this, you've already heard the wind speak. Follow it. The gold is dust, the vow is everything. Keep it, carry it, bury it if you must, but never forget what it's worth. The ring never lies, the river never forgets. The rest is yours now. She signed her name, Ada Vale, and beneath it a single word, carried. Then she stood, walked out to the cottonwood, and sat at the base like she always had, looking out across the hills as the sun rose. She folded the blanket over her knees and waited, not for anything in particular, but for the sound of hooves in the distance, for a knock at the door, for the trail to whisper a new name on the wind. She waited with peace in her chest and fire still in her bones. And when the time came, as it always does, the cabin didn't mourn. The earth didn't shake. The wind just moved gently through the grass, and the rings beneath the tree glowed a little brighter in the morning light. Because the vow had been kept, and somewhere someone new was already picking it up. They found the cabin 2 weeks later, a pair of riders cutting up through the canyon, following a map drawn in charcoal on the back of a prayer slip. One of them was a woman not yet 30, hard-eyed but quiet. The other a boy no older than 16 with a notebook tied to his saddle horn and a question in his chest that hadn't stopped burning since his father told him the story by firelight. They'd heard the legend in pieces, how a donkey wandered out of the desert carrying gold in a ring, how a woman named Ada Vale buried promises deeper than greed could reach, how she lit a lantern for every vow kept and never once looked back. They didn't come for gold, not really. They came because they'd lost something they couldn't name and hoped the trail still had room for people like them. When they rode up to the edge of the fence, they saw the chimney still standing and the porch still swept. The horses watered easily, the wind blew through the cottonwoods with no urgency, and when they stepped inside the cabin, it was as though Ada had only just stood up and stepped out for firewood. There was no dust on the journals, no ash in the hearth, only a note resting on the table beside a cup that still smelled faintly of whiskey and wild mint. If you've come this far, sit. The story's waiting. The woman opened the floorboard and found the box, the rings, the words. The boy opened the journal and started reading aloud, slow at first, stumbling over the old names and older pain, but soon his voice steadied, caught the rhythm, and they read together until night came down and the coyotes began to sing. They lit a fire and stayed 3 days. On the 4th, they packed what they could, took nothing they didn't understand, and left behind a ring of stones beneath the cottonwood, just one more circle added to the others. Before they left, the woman placed her own ring on the table. She didn't say who it was for, she didn't need to. The wind carried the door closed behind them, and the vow waited again. Seasons passed, slow and deliberate, wearing down the edges of the cabin, bowing the porch beams, and curling the corners of old pages beneath the floorboards. Moss crept up the stones near the cottonwood tree, where now 5 rings rested beneath the earth, each laid by a different hand, each placed with something heavier than gold. No one tended them anymore, not in the daily way, but the place never truly went untended. The trail was known now, not by many, but by enough. A whisper that traveled farther than the wind passed between drifters and daughters, between widows and watchmen, between men who'd broken their word and women who never had. They called it the House of the Kept Vow, though Ada had never once named it that herself. Names didn't matter. What mattered was that someone was always coming. Sometimes it was a woman who'd held a ring too long and needed the ground to take it. Sometimes it was a man who never wore one, but carried it just the same. Other times it was just someone lost, someone whose life had slipped sideways and who needed to sit by a fire that had once warmed a woman who kept her promises. They'd find the cabin with the journal inside and the firewood still stacked. They'd find the tin box and the note. And most didn't take anything. Most only added a page, a letam tongue, a name they couldn't speak out loud anywhere else. One winter, the snow came down harder than it had in years, burying the roof, the porch, and nearly sealing the door shut. But come spring, the thaw revealed that nothing had collapsed. The place stood, stubborn as ever. The cottonwood bloomed again. Wildflowers pushed up through the frost. And when the first traveler of the thaw came riding up the hill, an older woman with a scar through her lip and a journal of her own tied to her saddle, she stepped inside and sat at the same table Ada had written at all those years ago. She pulled out her pen, flipped to the last blank page, and wrote, "The rings remain, the wind remembers, and I have carried the vow as far as I could. It's yours now. Pass it on." Then she closed the book, tucked it back under the floor, and left the door open behind her. Because some doors should never be locked, and some promises should never be forgotten. After the woman left the door open, the breeze crept through the threshold like it knew where it was going. It moved slow across the floorboards, over the cracked rug, across the ash in the hearth, past the windows where the sun filtered in like gold through lace, and then out again, curling around the edge of the porch post, lifting a single leaf from the cottonwood tree and carrying it down the trail toward the river. The cabin, left in stillness, didn't feel empty. It never did. It felt watchful, ready. The kind of readiness that doesn't come from expectation, but from memory. That place had seen too much not to remember, and it remembered in everything: the ring-shaped knot in the table, the burn marks on the mantel from Ada's last winter there, the soft imprint on the porch rocker where she used to sit and whisper to no one at all. The wind wasn't the only one who returned. Animals came too. A fox that slept beneath the steps, a bird that nested in the eaves, a stray dog with a torn ear that showed up every spring and left when the heat came down. They all seemed to understand that this ground was different, that something sacred had settled here, not in holiness, but in human truth. Farther west, down in the towns where the saloons still echoed with lies, and the trains kept pulling in men who thought they could bend the land to their will, the legend of the rings grew louder. Gold wasn't mentioned often, not anymore, not since too many men had vanished trying to find it, but the vow, that stayed. There were whispers about a place where people left behind what couldn't be carried, where a woman with silver hair and tired eyes had kept the last honest story anyone knew. Some called it myth. Some said it was a warning, but a few believed. And those few, the ones who still carried rings in their pockets or maps in their memory, made their way there when the road grew too long. They always arrived quiet, always alone, and always with something to bury. One such man came in the second summer after the thaw. He was tall, thin, with the posture of someone who used to wear a badge but no longer did. He rode a mule, slow and deliberate, and wore 2 revolvers he didn't touch the whole ride up. When he reached the cabin, he didn't knock. He just tied his mule to the post and walked around the side toward the cottonwood. He stood there for a long time, staring at the tree, his hands in his pockets. Finally he knelt, dug a small hole with his bare hands, and placed something in it. No one saw what it was. No one asked. He covered it with dirt, stood, tipped his hat toward the river, and left without writing a word. The next was a girl, 12, freckles, dirty boots, eyes like a storm. She carried a letter she said was written by her grandmother. She read it aloud on the porch while no one listened, and afterward she cried once, loud and wild, then wiped her face on her sleeve and spent 2 days repairing the shutters. Before she left, she tucked the letter into the journal beneath the floor, folded with a ribbon. The last line of the letter read, "Some rings are never worn. They're just passed forward." That fall, the snow came late. The first frost didn't settle until the end of October, and the trail stayed clear long enough for 3 more to find the cabin. A preacher who had stopped preaching, a mother who'd buried a son, and a man who couldn't remember the name of the person who had given him the ring in his pocket. All of them left something behind, notes, tokens, ashes, names, and none of them took anything with them except silence. That was how the vow lived now, not in fire or gold or blood, but in the long, quiet walk away from the porch when a burden had been set down and no one had to carry it alone anymore. And still the cabin stood, and still the river whispered, and still the wind returned each dusk to pass its fingers through the trees, circling once, twice, then moving on. And somewhere far from there, another rider reached into their coat, touched a ring they'd never worn, and felt the pull of the trail beginning. Because the vow was not finished, it never would be. And as seasons folded into one another, the trail to the cabin became more than a direction. It became a kind of calling. Not everyone could find it. You had to be carrying something heavy, something wordless, grief maybe, regret. A name you couldn't say out loud. There were no markers, no guideposts, no roads, just a feeling that pulled from deep down in the marrow, like a compass born of memory instead of steel. And when people arrived, if they arrived, it wasn't because they were looking for gold. It was because something in them needed setting down in the one place that didn't ask questions. The journals multiplied. By the time the 7th winter passed since Ada's last written line, there were 3 more, each one bound in worn leather and etched with initials from hands that never wanted credit. One had entries written in Spanish, another in what looked like a child's scrawl. One was just filled with sketches, trees, rivers, faces, half finished. Every one of them held some piece of the vow, not the gold, not the map, the vow, the choice to carry something until it could be passed. One spring a rider came in limping, no horse, just a donkey that looked like it had walked 100 miles through fire. When he reached the cabin, he collapsed. The traveler already there, a soft-voiced woman who hadn't said her name, nursed him through a fever. When he woke, he asked, "Did I make it?" And she just smiled and said, "You did." He buried a small wooden box beneath the cottonwood, carved nothing, spoke nothing more, and left when the swelling in his leg went down. He never said what was in the box. No one asked, because that wasn't the way of the cabin. Some burdens needed silence. Some names needed only one person to hear them once. The cabin aged like all things do. Timbers bowed under years of wind and sun. The porch sagged just slightly on the east end, and the stone path to the river grew mossy in the corners. But it never collapsed. No matter how hard the snow came or how dry the summer turned, it stood, because the weight of the vow held it upright. Because it had become more than shelter, it had become story. And stories, when kept true, do not rot. They wait. By the time the 10th year passed since Ada had written her last words, the cabin had become a place spoken of in hushed voices across the territories. No one claimed to know its exact location, but everyone who carried a burden that felt too heavy to die with seemed to believe it was out there, somewhere between the river and the mountains, somewhere where a vow could be laid to rest. In the town of Ridgetop, a barkeep swore he once met a woman with hair like frost who passed through during a dust storm and left behind a gold ring and a note that simply said, "For the one who couldn't carry it anymore." In Dry Mule, an old lawman kept a worn page tucked into his breast pocket that read, "There is a tree that knows your name, and a cabin that will not turn you away." No one could prove where these words came from, but no one doubted them either. Then, one day, a child arrived. No rider, no saddle, no trail left behind. She was no more than 7, barefoot, sunburned, silent. She walked up the path with a tin can tied to her belt, and inside it was a folded letter sealed with wax. She didn't knock, just sat on the porch until the current caretaker, an older man with calloused hands and more patience than questions, opened the door and offered her water. She drank, ate bread, and finally handed over the letter. The man opened it slowly. The paper was rough, worn by travel and sun. It read, "To whoever is still listening, if this child finds you, know that I couldn't. My bones gave out 3 days east of the bend, and the promise I was carrying is now hers. The ring is in the can. I told her what it means. I told her where it belongs. I told her you'd understand. L." The man checked the can again and found the ring. It was thin, a woman's band, etched with a flower barely visible. The girl never said a word, just sat quietly by the fire that night, warming her hands. In the morning, they buried the ring under the cottonwood with the others. The caretaker carved a flower into the edge of the stone, not for remembrance, but because it felt right. When the girl left, she carried one of the journals with her. No one told her to. She just took it, held it close, and began walking south. And so the story grew another leg, one more vow carried farther still. The girl wasn't seen again for a long time. Years passed, and the cabin held its silence like it always had. Caretakers came and went, not chosen but called. Some stayed a season, some stayed until their hands could no longer split wood. Some left in the middle of the night, their burden too heavy to set down even in a place built to bear it. But the journals remained. The rings remained. The fire, when lit, always took with one match. And the vow, that unspoken promise to hold what others could no longer carry, stayed sharper than any edge, stronger than any lock. The cottonwood grew gnarled and wide, its roots creeping out like open arms beneath the soil, its branches always rustling, even when the wind held its breath. It had become the quiet witness to it all. Then, late one summer, as the air hung heavy and still and the birds hadn't sung in 3 days, she returned. Older now, her eyes not wide with fear, but narrow with memory. She rode a mule, gray and mean-looking, and tied behind her saddle was a satchel filled with letters, journals, coins that meant nothing, and 2 rings not yet buried. She dismounted slow, like she remembered the weight of the steps, and stood in front of the cabin for a long time before placing her hand on the door. It creaked open as it always had. No resistance, no surprise. Dust floated in sunbeams like drifting thoughts. She stepped inside, set the satchel on the table, and pulled from her coat the journal she had taken as a child. She laid it next to the others and ran her fingers along their spines. That night she lit the lantern and sat on the porch alone. When dawn crept up through the trees, gold and soft and clean, she took the 2 rings and buried them beneath the cottonwood, one for a woman who never made it, and one for the man who had carried her name across the mountains and still hadn't been able to let her go. She didn't mark the spot. She didn't write a note. She just placed her palm to the earth, nodded once, and whispered, "Carried." Later that morning, a rider approached, dirty and desperate, a fresh grave of pain behind his eyes. He started to speak, but she held up her hand. "Not yet," she said. "First, sit. Rest. The trail will still be there tomorrow." He obeyed, because something in her voice told him she knew what it meant to walk a trail too long, because the cabin wasn't just a place. It was a vow shaped into shelter, and the woman on the porch had become its keeper. He stayed for 3 days and never gave his name. That wasn't unusual. Many who arrived didn't, and the woman didn't ask. Names were heavy, and people who carried rings or journals or letters soaked through with tears didn't need more weight. He helped chop wood, mended a loose hinge on the back door, sat by the fire each night with his boots off and his hat in his lap. On the second night he opened his saddlebag and laid a ring on the table. It was gold, bent slightly out of shape, with burn marks on one side. He didn't explain it, just stared at it like he wasn't sure whether to let it go. The woman reached for the journal, opened to the next blank page, and slid it toward him with a pencil. "When you're ready," she said. He nodded but didn't write. On the 3rd morning he walked to the cottonwood alone. He dug the hole slow, knelt in the dirt, and laid the ring beside the others. He stayed a long time after, sitting in the grass with the wind in his hair, the river humming soft behind the trees. When he rode off that evening, he left the journal still blank. She didn't read into it. Not every vow needs to be written. Some are carved into silence and left behind in the way a person no longer flinches when the wind changes. The cabin remained still, solid. There were now over a dozen rings beneath the cottonwood, their metals and meanings all different, but bound by the same unspoken thread. Someone carried them as far as they could. The woman continued to tend the cabin. She replaced the roof that winter, patched the western wall come spring, and added another shelf for the growing stack of journals, some half full, some brimming, a few left with only a single name and a tear-stained page. She didn't try to explain the place to those who came. It explained itself. Sometimes people stayed, helped, learned the rhythm of the land, and left lighter than when they arrived. Sometimes they buried nothing, just sat with their stories until the trail called them forward again. A few left things that weren't rings, lockets, feathers, dog tags, a hand-carved whistle wrapped in cloth, but she treated them the same, not with ceremony, but with care. One summer, a woman arrived carrying the ashes of her brother in a tin marked with army insignia. She didn't say where she came from, only that he'd told her about a cabin he once stopped at, where the fire never asked questions. They buried the tin together, and after, the woman wept in the grass and whispered that she'd never believed in peace until now. The ring count grew, but the weight of the place didn't, because every vow set down was a burden lifted. Every promise fulfilled was a piece of silence finally allowed to rest. And the woman who kept it never needed to write her own name, because it was carried by everyone who walked away whole. One autumn, a storm rolled in from the west, big and black and mean, the kind that pulled trees from the earth and snapped fence posts like matchsticks. The woman had seen plenty in her time, but this one felt different, older, maybe. A reminder that the land could take back what it gave, if it chose. She shuttered the windows, stacked firewood high by the door, sealed the floorboards where the cold always tried to creep in. As the first thunder cracked and the rain came down like handfuls of gravel thrown by the sky itself, she sat at the table with all the journals spread out around her like a map of old lives. She lit the lantern, poured herself a mug of tea, and opened to the first one, the one Ada had written in, the one with the donkey and the gold dust and the ring that started it all. The ink had faded, but not the meaning. Every line still held weight, and as the storm raged outside, she read page after page, voice low and steady, as though the wind might be listening and needed reminding of the promises this place had kept. When the storm passed and the morning sun rose behind wet branches and fogged grass, the world outside looked a little rearranged. The trail had washed clean in places. The river swelled wide and proud, but the cabin still stood, the cottonwood still stretched toward the clouds, and the rings beneath it remained buried but not lost. She stepped outside, bare feet sinking into soft earth, and breathed deep. The air was sharp and fresh, and somewhere out in the distance she swore she heard hoofbeats, not near, not yet, but coming. They arrived 2 days later, 3 riders, one older woman, gray at the temples, and wearing grief like a second coat. A man with ink-stained hands who looked like he hadn't spoken in weeks. And a girl, no more than 10, clutching a handkerchief and an empty envelope. Each carried something they didn't want to keep. The woman placed a photograph face down on the mantel and said it was the only one left. The man buried a silver chain beneath the tree without ever opening his mouth. The girl folded the handkerchief into a perfect square, laid it on the step, and said, "Mama wanted this to be where it ended." The keeper didn't ask questions. She fed them stew, let them sleep. In the morning, the 3 of them rode off in separate directions without saying goodbye. That night, alone by the fire, the keeper opened a new journal. On the first page she wrote, "This place holds what the world cannot. If you've come here, leave what you must. Take only the silence with you." She set down her pen and listened to the wind outside. Soft now, not like the storm. It brushed past the porch and moved through the trees like it always had, reaching out for whatever came next.